Go ahead, the billionaire said with a smile that never reached his eyes. Tell everyone I'm the villain. No one important is going to believe a waitress. The words landed with a quiet weight of certainty, not because they were loud, but because everyone in the crystal room of the Ashford Grand Hotel believed them. Conversations faded into uneasy silence. Crystal glasses caught the glow of towering chandeliers. A jazz trio kept playing as if nothing had happened, and dozens of executives in custom-tailored suits suddenly found the marble floor far more interesting than the young woman standing beside table 12. Ethan Caldwell, 38 years old, founder and CEO of Caldwell Dynamics, had built a reputation worth billions on confidence, precision, and absolute control. Investors admired him. Competitors feared him. Employees learned quickly that mistakes had consequences. To Ethan, respect was earned through power, and power belonged to whoever could never be challenged. Tonight was supposed to celebrate the largest technology merger of the year, a deal that financial networks had already called historic before the contracts were even signed. Reporters filled the lobby downstairs. Luxury cars stretched around the block, and every guest inside believed they were witnessing the future of American business. Instead, they were about to witness something entirely different. Naomi Brooks stood perfectly still, one hand resting lightly against the serving tray she had carried all evening. At 26, she had mastered the invisible art shared by countless hospitality workers across the country. She anticipated needs before anyone asked. She remembered names after hearing them only once. She smiled without inviting attention and moved quietly enough that powerful people often forgot she was there at all. Her uniform was spotless despite a 12-hour shift. Her posture remained straight despite the ache in her feet. She never interrupted conversations, never reacted to rude remarks, and never forgot what her late grandmother used to tell her every Sunday morning. Dignity, she would whisper, is the one thing nobody can take unless you hand it away. Yourself. Those words echoed through Naomi's mind as Ethan looked directly at her, irritation replacing the polished charm he displayed for investors only moments earlier. An accidental bump during a crowded dinner service had left a few drops of sparkling water on the sleeve of his expensive jacket. It was hardly noticeable, something most people would have laughed off before asking for another napkin. But Ethan didn't laugh. He stared at the tiny droplets as though they represented something far greater than spilled water. Around him, executives waited for his reaction. Hotel managers held their breath. Servers froze beside their stations. Naomi quietly apologized for the inconvenience, her voice calm, steady, and respectful, but Ethan dismissed the apology with the effortless confidence of someone who had spent years believing the world naturally divided itself into people who mattered and people who didn't. A guest near the window slowly lowered his phone after realizing he had already started recording without thinking. Another exchanged nervous glances with his wife. Somewhere across the ballroom, a champagne cork popped, sounding strangely distant inside the growing silence. Naomi could feel every pair of eyes settling on her, measuring her, waiting for tears, anger, or embarrassment. She offered none of them. She simply met Ethan's gaze with quiet composure, the kind that couldn't be purchased, negotiated, or demanded. What nobody inside that magnificent ballroom understood. Not the executives, not the hotel staff, not even Ethan Caldwell himself, was that before the night was over, the most powerful person in the building would not be the billionaire standing beneath the chandelier. It would be the woman everyone had mistaken for invisible. Naomi Brooks had learned long ago that silence could protect a person almost as well as words. Every weekday began before sunrise inside a modest apartment on the south side of Chicago, where the coffee maker hummed louder than the old refrigerator and the morning news echoed through thin walls. She lived alone now, but every habit in that apartment carried someone else's memory. The bookshelf by the window still held worn novels that had belonged to her grandmother. A faded photograph rested beside a small ceramic bird on the kitchen counter, showing a smiling woman whose gentle eyes always seemed to remind Naomi to stand tall no matter who stood in front of her. After her grandmother passed away 3 years earlier, Naomi had quietly promised herself that hardship would never become an excuse to lose kindness. Life had tested that promise more times than she could count. She worked double shifts whenever the hotel needed extra staff. She volunteered at a neighborhood youth center twice a month, teaching teenagers basic interview skills because she believed confidence could open doors that money sometimes could not. She never talked about those weekends. She simply showed up. Her coworkers often wondered why guests naturally trusted Naomi within minutes of meeting her. The answer was simple. She listened more than she spoke. She noticed details everyone else ignored. She remembered birthdays, favorite drinks, and the names of children who only visited once a year. To most guests, she was simply another server in a black uniform. Yet to many families, she had quietly become part of the memories they carried home. Even so, the luxury hospitality industry had taught Naomi another lesson. Expensive suits did not always hide generous hearts, and polished smiles often disappeared the moment something went wrong. She had been mistaken for housekeeping more times than she could remember. Some guests snapped their fingers instead of saying, "Excuse me." Others talked about her as though she were part of the furniture standing beside the dining table. The comments rarely surprised her anymore. What surprised her was how quickly people revealed themselves when they believed someone beneath them had no voice. That was why she never judged anyone by wealth alone. She judged them by how they treated people who could offer them nothing in return. Tonight had begun like countless other gala events. The ballroom sparkled beneath imported crystal chandeliers. Famous entrepreneurs laughed over million-dollar investments. Reporters waited outside, hoping to capture headlines before sunrise. Naomi had expected another long evening filled with careful service and polite smiles. Instead, she found herself standing at the center of a room where every heartbeat seemed louder than the orchestra. Her fellow servers exchanged anxious glances from across the ballroom, silently asking whether she was all right. The hotel manager shifted uneasily, clearly calculating how to protect an important client without losing an excellent employee. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Ethan Caldwell adjusted the cuff of his jacket with practiced composure, apparently convinced the uncomfortable moment had already ended. To him, the evening remained under control. To everyone else, something invisible had changed. Respect had quietly left the room, replaced by uncertainty that settled over every table like a winter fog. Naomi slowly reached for a fresh linen napkin and placed it gently beside Ethan without a trace of resentment on her face. Her calmness confused the guests more than any angry response could have. Some expected tears. Others expected an argument. Instead, they witnessed discipline that seemed almost impossible under the circumstances. Deep inside, Naomi remembered another sentence her grandmother had repeated for years. Character reveals itself most clearly when nobody expects grace. She inhaled once, offered a courteous nod, and turned to continue her work as though the evening still belonged to every guest equally. She did not notice that across the ballroom, an older gentleman in a charcoal suit had quietly stopped his conversation and fixed his attention entirely on her, his expression changing from casual curiosity to unmistakable concern. Ethan Caldwell had not become one of the youngest billionaire chief executive officers in America by believing in second chances. He believed in measurable results, flawless execution, and the simple idea that hesitation cost more than failure. At 38, his face appeared regularly on the covers of business magazines beside headlines celebrating innovation, leadership, and record-breaking growth. Financial commentators praised his instincts. Investors trusted his confidence. Business schools analyzed his negotiations as though they were master classes. From the outside, Ethan represented the modern American success story, a man who had transformed a small software startup into Caldwell Dynamics, a technology empire valued in the tens of billions of dollars. Yet the people who worked closest to him understood another version of Ethan, one rarely photographed and never discussed during interviews. Inside corporate headquarters, meetings often ended in complete silence because nobody wanted to become the next employee singled out for a mistake. He demanded perfection from everyone around him because he secretly demanded even more from himself. Years earlier, before private jets, luxury penthouses, and international recognition, Ethan had grown up in a household where failure was treated as weakness instead of experience. His father believed respect belonged only to winners, and every report card, every athletic competition, every accomplishment carried one unspoken message: be the best, or you're invisible. Ethan never forgot those lessons. He simply carried them into adulthood, where competition became his language and control became his shield. Success followed him everywhere, but so did isolation. Friendships gradually became business relationships. Conversations became negotiations. Even compliments sounded like transactions waiting for a return on investment. Somewhere along the journey, he stopped noticing the difference between commanding respect and demanding obedience. Tonight, he arrived at the Ashford Grand Hotel believing the celebration belonged to him. Every executive greeted him with admiration. Cameras followed his every movement. Hotel management personally welcomed him through the front entrance, while staff members worked carefully to ensure every detail reflected excellence. Ethan accepted the attention naturally because it matched the world he had built around himself. When the brief accident involving the glass of sparkling water interrupted the evening, he reacted the same way he approached disappointing quarterly reports or failed business proposals. He saw an error that deserved correction instead of a simple human moment. He never considered how deeply a few careless words could echo through an entire ballroom, because he had spent years surrounded by people who rarely challenged him. As Naomi quietly walked away to continue serving nearby tables, Ethan believed the matter had already disappeared. He returned to discussing acquisition strategies with investors, speaking confidently about market expansion, artificial intelligence, and the future of American innovation. Several guests nodded enthusiastically, but their attention drifted elsewhere. The atmosphere no longer carried the excitement that had filled the room only minutes earlier. Conversations sounded forced. Laughter arrived late and faded quickly. Even the musicians seemed to lower their volume without realizing it. Ethan noticed the subtle shift, but dismissed it as pre-deal tension. Across the ballroom, however, another pair of eyes remained fixed on him. The distinguished gentleman in the charcoal suit had quietly stepped away from his colleagues and now watched every detail with remarkable patience. He was not impressed by billion-dollar valuations or polished speeches. Instead, he studied character, and in less than 5 minutes he had learned more about Ethan Caldwell than years of magazine profiles could ever reveal. When one of the hotel's senior managers hurried over to greet the gentleman with visible respect, several longtime employees immediately straightened their posture. Naomi noticed the reaction from the corner of her eye, although she did not recognize the visitor. She simply sensed that the evening, which had already taken one unexpected turn, was beginning to move toward another that no one in the ballroom could possibly predict. The ballroom slowly recovered its polished rhythm, but only on the surface. Beneath the soft jazz and polished conversations, something had shifted that no amount of expensive decor could conceal. Guests who had arrived expecting another glamorous corporate celebration now exchanged cautious glances across linen-covered tables. A few discreetly checked their phones after noticing short video clips from moments earlier quietly spreading through private group chats. Nobody had posted anything publicly. Not yet. Still, everyone understood how quickly one uncomfortable moment could become tomorrow morning's headline. The hotel's general manager, Daniel Mercer, walked briskly across the marble floor, forcing a reassuring smile that failed to reach his anxious eyes. He had managed luxury properties for more than 20 years and understood one painful truth about reputation. It took decades to build and only seconds to damage. He approached Ethan Caldwell with practiced professionalism, offering another freshly pressed dinner jacket while carefully avoiding any mention of what had happened. Ethan accepted it without hesitation, thanking Daniel before returning to business as though the evening had never been interrupted. His confidence remained untouched. In his mind, the guests had already moved on because they always did. Power, he believed, had a way of rewriting memories. Across the room, Naomi quietly continued serving coffee to another table occupied by visiting investors from Seattle. Her movements remained graceful and steady, yet several guests who had ignored her all evening suddenly looked at her differently. Not with pity, but with curiosity. One elderly woman offered a warm smile as Naomi refilled her cup. A younger executive quietly whispered, "Thank you," with unexpected sincerity. Small gestures, almost invisible, yet they reminded Naomi that kindness often survived even inside rooms where arrogance seemed louder. Daniel eventually reached her near the service station. He lowered his voice and apologized for the situation, explaining that the hotel valued her professionalism and asking whether she needed a short break. Naomi thanked him politely but declined. There were still guests waiting to be served, and she refused to allow one unpleasant moment to define the entire evening. Daniel nodded with genuine respect before walking away, silently admiring a level of composure that many executives earning seven-figure salaries could never imitate. Meanwhile, the distinguished gentleman in the charcoal suit remained remarkably still beside one of the ballroom's towering windows. He accepted neither champagne nor conversation. Instead, he watched the room with patient observation, almost as though he were measuring every person's character rather than listening to their words. Two impeccably dressed men stood several feet behind him without speaking, blending naturally into the elegant surroundings despite their unmistakable alertness. Their quiet presence did not resemble hotel security. It carried the disciplined confidence of people accustomed to protecting someone whose importance required no introduction. Ethan finally noticed the small group near the window. He leaned toward one of his senior partners and asked quietly whether they recognized the older gentleman. Surprisingly, the partner simply shook his head. Neither the guest list nor the financial reports had mentioned anyone fitting that description. Ethan dismissed the curiosity almost immediately, assuming the man was another wealthy donor or retired executive attending as someone's guest. He turned back toward his investors with another confident smile, completely unaware that several members of the hotel staff had begun treating the gentleman with extraordinary deference. Even Daniel Mercer personally escorted him toward a private seating area reserved only for the most distinguished visitors. Naomi caught the brief exchange while carrying a tray of desserts past the grand staircase. For the first time that evening, the older gentleman looked directly at her. He did not wave. He did not smile. He simply gave the slightest respectful nod, as though acknowledging someone far more significant than anyone else in the ballroom realized. Naomi hesitated for only a fraction of a second before returning the gesture with quiet courtesy, never imagining that this nearly invisible exchange was about to change the course of every life inside the Ashford Grand Hotel. Outside the towering glass entrance of the Ashford Grand Hotel, the city continued its ordinary rhythm, unaware that the balance of power inside was quietly beginning to change. Luxury sedans rolled past the valet stand. Tourists stopped to admire the illuminated skyline, and distant sirens blended into the familiar soundtrack of downtown Chicago. Then, almost without warning, a line of identical black sport utility vehicles turned the corner with remarkable precision. They did not speed. They did not draw attention through noise. They simply arrived with calm confidence, one after another, until nearly 20 vehicles formed an orderly procession along the curb. Experienced valets exchanged uncertain glances. They had welcomed celebrities, governors, championship athletes, and international business leaders before, yet none of those arrivals had carried this peculiar sense of disciplined silence. Every driver stepped out at nearly the same moment, each wearing the same dark suit, each speaking into a discreet earpiece before opening the rear passenger doors. Hotel security instinctively straightened their posture. The concierge quietly instructed junior staff to keep the entrance clear without offering any explanation. Inside the ballroom, nobody had seen the vehicles yet, but an invisible ripple had already reached the building. Daniel Mercer received a brief message through his headset. His expression changed immediately. Without interrupting the guests, He excused himself from a conversation and walked briskly toward the main lobby. Several longtime employees noticed his unusual urgency and exchanged puzzled looks. Daniel was known for remaining composed during every crisis. Yet tonight his pace suggested the arrival of someone whose importance exceeded even the billionaire executives gathered upstairs. Naomi, carrying a polished silver tray toward the kitchen, noticed Daniel disappearing through the grand hallway, but continued working without asking questions. She had learned that luxury hotels were filled with unexpected arrivals, and curiosity rarely belonged in professional service. Back in the ballroom, Ethan Caldwell remained completely focused on final discussions surrounding the merger announcement. His legal team reviewed documents while investors debated market forecasts and future expansion into defense technology. Ethan smiled confidently, believing the evening had regained its original momentum. He never noticed that several guests near the ballroom entrance had quietly stopped talking altogether. Their attention drifted toward the hallway, where subtle movement among hotel staff hinted that someone extraordinary had just entered the building. A few executives recognized the pattern immediately. Wealth announced itself through expensive watches and custom suits. Real influence rarely needed either. It revealed itself through the reactions of everyone else. Soft footsteps echoed across the marble corridor. The musicians inside the ballroom continued playing, yet even the music somehow felt more restrained, as though the room itself sensed a change before anyone could explain it. Daniel Mercer personally appeared at the ballroom entrance only moments later. Instead of returning alone, he paused respectfully beside the doorway with the posture of someone welcoming an honored guest. The distinguished gentleman in the charcoal suit who had quietly observed Naomi earlier now approached the entrance at an unhurried pace. The two impeccably dressed men followed several steps behind, saying nothing and scanning the room with calm professionalism rather than intimidation. Conversations gradually dissolved into whispers. Nobody announced the visitor's name. Nobody needed to. His presence alone transformed the atmosphere more effectively than any introduction could have. Ethan finally looked up from the contract in front of him, mildly irritated that another distraction threatened the evening's schedule. He expected another wealthy donor or political figure seeking attention. Instead, he found the older gentleman walking calmly through the ballroom without acknowledging the executives waiting to greet him. The visitor passed tables filled with influential people, ignored the cluster of cameras near the stage, and continued forward with unwavering focus. His eyes searched only for one person. They stopped the moment they found Naomi Brooks standing quietly beside the dessert station, completely unaware that every step bringing the gentleman closer was carrying the entire evening toward a revelation that would leave the most powerful people in the room questioning everything they thought they understood about status, influence, and respect. The older gentleman crossed the ballroom with the unhurried confidence of someone who had never needed to raise his voice to command attention. Every polished shoe seemed to pause against the marble floor as conversations faded into complete silence. Even the musicians slowly lowered the volume of their instruments without realizing why. Naomi Brooks noticed him approaching only when he was a few feet away. She immediately offered the same professional smile she had given every guest throughout the evening. "Good evening, sir. May I bring you anything to drink?" she asked gently. The gentleman looked at her for a long moment, not with curiosity, not with admiration, but with unmistakable concern. His eyes briefly scanned her face before resting on the sleeve of her uniform, where a faint wrinkle remained from the uncomfortable encounter earlier that evening. His expression softened. "Naomi," he said quietly, his voice carrying surprising warmth, "are you all right?" The question was simple, yet it landed with greater force than any speech delivered that night. Naomi blinked in surprise. She did not remember ever meeting him. "Yes, sir," she answered politely. "Thank you for asking. I am perfectly fine." The gentleman nodded slowly, though his eyes suggested he was searching for an answer beyond the words themselves. "Are you certain?" he asked once more. "No one has made your evening more difficult than it should have been." Naomi hesitated for the briefest moment before offering the same composed smile that had carried her through years of long shifts and demanding guests. "I appreciate your kindness," she replied. "Everything is under control." Around them, dozens of executives watched the exchange without understanding its significance. Ethan Caldwell folded his arms across his chest, mildly puzzled that a distinguished guest had ignored an entire room filled with influential investors simply to speak with one waitress. Several members of the hotel staff appeared equally confused, although Daniel Mercer stood quietly near the entrance with the unmistakable expression of someone who understood far more than he could publicly say. The two impeccably dressed men who had accompanied the older gentleman remained several steps behind him, their attention focused entirely on the surrounding room rather than the conversation itself. They spoke to no one. They interrupted no one. Their disciplined stillness somehow drew even more attention than movement would have. One senior executive leaned toward another and whispered, "Who is he?" The other could only shake his head. Nobody seemed willing to guess. The gentleman finally offered Naomi a gentle smile. "I am relieved to hear that," he said. "You have always had more strength than you realize." Naomi est surprise deepened. Those words sounded personal, yet she still could not place his face. Before she could ask another question, he turned calmly toward Daniel Mercer. The general manager immediately stepped forward with obvious respect. "Everything has been prepared, sir," Daniel said quietly. As requested, the gentleman thanked him with a courteous nod before slowly turning his attention toward the center of the ballroom. For the first time that evening, his gaze settled on Ethan Caldwell. The room seemed to grow noticeably quieter. Ethan straightened instinctively, meeting the older man's eyes with the confident expression that had carried him through countless negotiations. Neither man spoke for several seconds. Guests glanced nervously between them, sensing that something far larger than a business introduction was unfolding. Then the gentleman asked Daniel a single calm question, spoken softly enough that only those closest could hear it. "Would you please tell me," he said, "which guest believed it was acceptable to speak to Miss Brooks with such disrespect?" At that instant, every heartbeat inside the ballroom seemed to pause, and Ethan Caldwell realized for the first time all evening that the night was no longer following his plan. Daniel Mercer did not answer immediately. Years of managing luxury hotels had taught him that every word carried consequences, especially when spoken before witnesses. He looked briefly toward Ethan Caldwell, then back to the older gentleman whose calm expression somehow carried more authority than the combined influence of every executive in the ballroom. Before Daniel could respond, one of the senior investors quietly stepped forward. "It was an unfortunate misunderstanding," he said carefully. "There is no need to make the situation any larger than it already is." The gentleman acknowledged the comment with a courteous nod, but never removed his eyes from Ethan. "Respect is never a misunderstanding," he replied. "It is always a choice." The sentence settled over the room like a heavy silence. Ethan finally took a confident step forward, extending his hand with a polished smile that had secured countless billion-dollar agreements. "Ethan Caldwell," he said, "I do not believe we have met." The gentleman glanced at the offered hand before politely folding both of his own behind his back. The gesture was neither hostile nor dramatic. It simply left Ethan's hand suspended for an awkward second before he quietly lowered it. Several guests exchanged uncertain glances. Ethan was not accustomed to introductions being declined. "My name," the gentleman answered calmly, "is Vincent Moretti." The name spread through the ballroom faster than any whisper. One executive visibly lost his composure. Another nearly dropped his glass before catching it at the last moment. A corporate attorney, standing near the stage, slowly looked down at the floor as though replaying years of newspaper headlines inside his memory. Vincent Moretti rarely appeared in public, almost never attended business galas, and never sought publicity. Yet stories about his influence had circulated through financial circles for decades. His investments reached industries across the country. His charitable foundation had rebuilt hospitals, funded scholarships, and quietly rescued struggling neighborhoods that larger institutions had forgotten. He spoke little, but people listened carefully whenever he did. Ethan recognized the name immediately. Even he understood that many powerful individuals considered Vincent someone whose trust was earned slowly and whose disappointment carried lasting consequences. Still, Ethan maintained his composure. "It is an honor to meet you," he said evenly. "Had I known you were attending, I would have welcomed you personally." Vincent offered a faint smile. "I did not come here to be welcomed." His attention shifted back toward Naomi, who remained standing quietly beside the dessert station, still unsure why the evening had taken such an unexpected direction. "I came because someone I care about was working tonight." Those words echoed through the ballroom with astonishing clarity. Nobody spoke. Nobody reached for a drink. Even the musicians had quietly stopped playing. Ethan's expression changed almost imperceptibly as he looked from Vincent to Naomi and back again, trying to understand a connection that made no sense within the world he believed he understood. Naomi herself looked genuinely surprised. "Sir," she said softly, "I think there must be some mistake." Vincent's eyes warmed with unmistakable affection. "There is no mistake, Naomi," he answered. "Your grandmother spent more than 40 years protecting my family when we had nothing. Before she passed away, she made me promise that I would always look after you if you ever needed me. She never wanted you to know because she believed your future should be built by your own character, not by my reputation." Naomi felt her breath catch as memories of her grandmother suddenly returned with startling clarity, including the mysterious family friend she had mentioned only a handful of times, but had never fully explained. Around the ballroom, every assumption that had shaped the evening quietly collapsed. The waitress everyone had overlooked had never depended on power to possess dignity, and the billionaire who believed influence belonged only to wealth had just discovered that the strongest relationships in the room had been completely invisible until this very moment. Ethan Caldwell had spent his entire career believing that influence could solve almost any problem. He had negotiated hostile acquisitions, persuaded skeptical investors, and recovered from market downturns that had driven competitors into bankruptcy. Standing beneath the crystal chandeliers of the Ashford Grand Hotel, however, he discovered a challenge no financial strategy had prepared him for. The room no longer responded to his confidence. It responded to truth. Nobody rushed to defend him. Nobody laughed at his earlier remarks. Instead, executives who had admired his decisiveness only an hour before quietly reconsidered everything they had witnessed. One by one, conversations resumed, but they were no longer about the merger. They were about leadership, judgment, and the hidden cost of arrogance. Several investors discreetly stepped away from Ethan's table to make private phone calls. A member of Caldwell Dynamics' board of directors, who had attended the gala to celebrate the historic agreement, received a message containing a short video recorded earlier that evening. The clip lasted less than 30 seconds, yet it captured enough to raise difficult questions about the public image of the company's chief executive officer. The director watched it twice before slipping the phone back into his pocket, his expression noticeably heavier than before. Across the ballroom, Vincent Moretti remained remarkably composed. He neither demanded apologies nor threatened consequences. He simply stood beside Naomi Brooks with quiet dignity, allowing everyone present to reach their own conclusions. That silence proved far more powerful than anger ever could have been. Daniel Mercer approached Naomi once again, this time with unmistakable respect rather than concern. He thanked her for maintaining her professionalism throughout the evening and assured her that the hotel would fully support her if any questions arose after the event. Naomi accepted his words with characteristic humility, insisting that she wanted no special treatment. She only hoped the evening could end peacefully for everyone involved. Her response surprised even Vincent, whose eyes reflected quiet pride rather than surprise. He had expected kindness from her because that was exactly the woman her grandmother had raised. Ethan finally walked toward Naomi, every confident step from earlier replaced by thoughtful restraint. The ballroom became silent once again as guests wondered what he would say. For the first time in years, Ethan understood that titles, wealth, and recognition offered no protection against an honest moment of self-reflection. He looked directly at Naomi before speaking. "Miss Brooks," he said calmly, "I allowed my frustration to become disrespect. That was my mistake, and I sincerely apologize." His words were measured, genuine, and free from excuses. Naomi studied his expression for a brief moment before offering a gentle nod. "Thank you," she replied. An apology means the most when it is followed by different choices. Ethan quietly accepted the answer without argument. Nearby, several board members exchanged approving glances. They understood that rebuilding trust would require far more than one conversation. Yet they also recognized that accountability always began with a single decision. As the evening slowly returned to its formal schedule, the atmosphere felt entirely different from the celebration that had begun hours earlier. The merger announcement suddenly seemed less significant than the lesson everyone had witnessed. Stock prices could rise and fall. Companies could expand or disappear. Fortune could change with a single market cycle. Character, however, revealed itself in ordinary moments when no one expected history to remember. Before leaving the ballroom, Vincent looked once more toward Ethan and spoke in the same calm voice that had transformed the entire evening. "The greatest privilege in life," he said, "is not being powerful enough to command respect. It is becoming wise enough to deserve it." No one answered because there was nothing left to add. The room had already learned the lesson. The gala eventually came to its planned conclusion, but no one who walked out of the Ashford Grand Hotel that evening remembered the merger announcement as the defining moment. They remembered the quiet waitress who had refused to surrender her dignity, the billionaire who discovered that success, without humility, could become an empty victory, and the distinguished gentleman whose calm words carried greater weight than any display of wealth. By sunrise, business reporters praised Caldwell Dynamics for its ambitious expansion plans. Yet among the guests who had attended in person, a different conversation continued. They spoke about leadership. They spoke about character. Most of all, they spoke about the remarkable composure of Naomi Brooks. She returned to work the following week exactly as she always had. She greeted every guest with the same warm professionalism. She treated first-time visitors and long-time regulars with equal courtesy. She never mentioned Vincent Moretti. She never repeated the story to attract sympathy or admiration. When curious coworkers asked whether her life would change now that everyone knew she had a connection to such an influential man, Naomi simply smiled and answered that kindness should never depend on who happened to know your name. Those words spread quietly throughout the hotel until they became part of the culture Daniel Mercer hoped every new employee would embrace. Ethan Caldwell also changed, although not overnight. Real growth rarely arrived in a single conversation. It appeared through consistent choices made when nobody was watching. He began meeting employees without formal presentations. He spent time speaking with receptionists, custodians, and food service teams across his company, asking questions he had never considered asking before. During one leadership conference several months later, a young entrepreneur asked him what the most important lesson of his career had been. The audience expected him to describe a brilliant investment or a difficult negotiation. Instead, Ethan paused before answering. "The most expensive mistake I ever made," he said, "cost me nothing on financial statement, but it showed me the difference between authority and respect. Authority can be purchased through position. Respect must be earned one person at a time." The room responded with thoughtful silence before offering sincere applause. Vincent Moretti never publicly discussed what had happened that evening. He continued supporting hospitals, scholarship programs, and neighborhood charities with the same quiet generosity that had defined his life for decades. From time to time, he visited the hotel for dinner, always requesting a table in Naomi's section if she happened to be working. Their conversations remained simple, often revolving around family memories and her grandmother's unwavering belief that integrity outlasted influence. Neither of them needed to revisit the past because its lesson had already taken root. Years later, guests still shared the story without exaggeration because the truth required no embellishment. They remembered that the most impressive person in the ballroom had not been the wealthiest executive or the most celebrated investor. It had been the woman who answered disrespect with grace, confidence with humility, and unexpected recognition with quiet gratitude. In a world that often measured people by titles, fortunes, and influence, that evening offered a different measure entirely. Real strength was revealed by how someone treated those who could offer nothing in return. Real power appeared in the courage to choose dignity over pride. And long after the lights inside the ballroom had faded and every expensive suit had disappeared into the night, one simple truth remained. Money could fill a room with attention, but only character could leave it with respect.